following on these three great presentations, there's really a lot of substance in what we've heard so far. I think I'm going to compliment them well. I'm an economist. I think the prices are insufficient to achieve our carbon reduction goals, and it's imperative that we have prices. So I'm going to try to reconcile those points of view for you and explain to you that if we don't figure out how to make prices work with other regulatory policies, then we're really in a bind. So the outline, I want to talk about some price histories and other trading programs and factors that affect price formation, reform efforts in the EU specifically, and lessons from the North American approach. So this was referred to in what our speakers earlier just said. There's been this sort of historic shift. It's really important because we're talking about the shift of hundreds of billions of dollars in asset value away from free allocation to incumbent firms to this notion of a payment for environmental services, which means the value of emission allowances, if you will, or if your brain is in a carbon tax world, the value of the revenues collected under a carbon tax, it's now in play in the public policy debate. It's no longer given for free to the coal plant that has the greatest historic emissions, as Andrew was saying. So when we look at the history of allowance prices, we've got to recognize gravity. There is a secular trend in all of the existing markets for long-term decline in emission allowances in these trading markets, and that has been interpreted by many observers as a signal that these programs either are failing or aren't doing what we want them to do. I'm going to give you some quick pictures, not all of them about Canada or the EU. So here's the Illinois volatile organic compounds market and how its price history over several years. This is the US SO2 allowance price market. The yellow line in this picture shows what projected trends were by the US EPA, and then this shows what the actual price history was over this time period. There was a ramp up affected by the CARE rule, which really was the beginning of a new regime. Then Hurricane Katrina sent prices shooting up, but then they quickly collapsed back down. This is the US Knox trading program, where prices in the first year of the program, there was uncertainty. States were just joining the program. Maryland was late to join the program. The allowances were scarce. As soon as it settled out, prices were just on a downward path to be about 1/3 of what they were anticipated to be. This is the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative program in the Northeast US states, 9 US states now, although New Jersey has just decided to declare that it's going to rejoin, and Virginia is on the cusp of joining. That would bring it up to 11 states. After the program began in 2009, for 11 straight auctions, you'll see that they have a price floor, which is a minimum price, and we'll talk about that in a minute, and it was brought up earlier in this panel. For 11 straight auctions in that program, going over almost 3 years, the price was at the price floor. The price was pushed down to this price floor. If that price floor hadn't existed, the price would have gone to zero for sure. That program would have gone away, the program architecture would have gone away, and we would have to start from scratch all over again if you were going to do anything with carbon pricing. And then this is Quebec and California's program, where we see the prices after originally up at shooting through $20 early on, fell back down and have hovered at or just above the price floor for the most of the time into that program. So I hope I've convinced you that there's this history of downward pressure on these prices. In the EU ETS intention was that carbon trading would be the cornerstone of the EU's policy and a key tool for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And when the EU ETS emissions trading system was first put in place, it was expected to have prices in the range of $30 per ton CO2. And we already saw a picture earlier of the price history in the EU ETS. In the first phase, the trial period, prices collapsed to zero. There's backstories on all this. I could go on and on, but I'm trying to get to some other points. So maybe if you want more background, various ones of us can give it to you in question and answer. In the second phase, price fell down, and now in the third phase, prices are low and sort of stable around €4 to €6 per ton. So recognizing that gravity is a strong force, I want to ask why. Why is this happening in all these markets? Well, one is political economy. Who is in the room when, as you know, in the Hamilton play, who was in the room when the decision was made? They're going to win in sort of the allocation debate. But secondly, maybe these programs, if you'll give us the benefit of the doubt, maybe they work a little bit the way economists think they're going to work, and it provides an incentive to look for lower ways to anticipate cost, to reduce costs that could not be anticipated ex ante. That's what we call innovation. So maybe there is a dynamic that's driving down the price and fueling discovery in these programs. But another very important point is what I call not complementary policies, but companion policies, because I think from many advocates, they're going to say pricing is the complementary policy because they want to drive with the direct regulatory measures. And in any case, to avoid a secular or a sectarian argument on that, I'm going to call them companion policies that serve additional concerns such as air quality, job creation, economic development, and good old-fashioned just fighting for rents. And so there's all these policies are going on at the same time as we try to introduce carbon pricing. There's sub-jurisdictional efforts. Boy, there's no better example of that in the world than in Canada. And then there's program-related spending. Let me show you what I mean by these points. But what they all add up to is what I call the waterbed effect. If you put a cap on emission allowances and you do something in the province of Quebec to push down, if there was a national cap, to push down on allowances, on allowance usage, it just makes allowances available to be used somewhere else in the program. So for example, between Quebec and California, if Quebec does more, California can get away with doing less. So an emissions cap is actually an emissions floor. It's specifying the minimum amount of emissions that are going to occur. Well, how does that work? What kind of incentive does that give to firms, local governments, or churches to do extra measures? Or this gentleman who reduces emissions at his house, and then his neighbor says, "What are you doing that for? It just makes it easier for me to emit more." So we have this interesting issue in program design that we have to solve, this waterbed effect. So now this is a picture from the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and I'm just using this one instead of Quebec or the EU because I'm going to come back to it at the end. This shows the design of that program. There is a price floor at $2.15. There's a kind of a soft price ceiling, and if prices get to $10, there's 10 million tons additional allowances that are made available to the program. But over the vast majority of expected prices, there's just what economists will call a vertical supply curve, that you can get any price along that vertical part, and the cap is, what just happened there? That's interesting. I didn't ask it to do that. It's let's see what happens. Okay, well, I'll just use this wheel. That works. So if this is the demand curve, you can see where the price is expected to be. What happens if the demand falls? For example, your solar photovoltaic on your house means that you don't use as much electricity, or cities and other jurisdictions are doing more, or there's innovation in any of these things that push down prices on all these programs. The price falls, there's no change in emissions. That's what I call the waterbed effect. So what are we going to do about this problem? If the regional emissions don't change. Well, in these programs, compared to the earlier emissions trading programs for SO2 or Knox, I mean, there are 2 orders of magnitude greater asset value that's created by putting a price on carbon than by putting in the early trading programs, where we have experience in environmental economics. And so now I'm going to take this picture to the next level and recognize when we liberate this asset value as payment for environmental services, where's this asset value going to go? And there's 2 competing ideas about where it should go. One is that the asset value is really the province of government. Like a carbon tax, people would think about, well, this is the decision, the government should decide what to do with this revenue. There's sort of a populist view that it's actually the province of individuals. It's a common property resource, that individuals own the atmosphere resource, so this money should accrue to the individuals that are harmed by a worsening environment. And this is getting played out. We see on the government side, we're seeing some economists will advocate, and we heard mentioned this before, of a tax swap, reducing the corporate tax in order to provide an incentive for more investment in a jurisdiction while putting a price on carbon. So tax the bad things, not the good things. Or you could imagine equity, address environmental justice issues, maybe give the revenue back to individuals, or the efficacy issues, using the revenue to make these programs work better. And the most important of these in the programs that I'm looking at are the program-related spending. So we have hundreds of billions of dollars ultimately being identified and brought into the economic system, and where does that revenue end up? We look at these programs, like in RGGI, this is showing you the annual asset value on the left, annual asset value in the RGGI program, and on the right is a pie graph, and I've circled in red where the asset value is being reinvested in the program in clean energy or in energy efficiency. And what does that do is it drives down the price of emission allowances in these programs. It's doing a great deal of work to explain why prices are falling in these programs. This is the California program, and showing that all the green area is programs run by the state that are similar investments in program-related activities. And then this one down in the lower right is where an allocation to the electric distribution utilities and their required investments in energy efficiency. This is in Quebec, where more than half of the total asset value is going into program-related investments in Quebec. And in the EUTS, although 55%, it was mentioned earlier, of the asset value is being given away to industry, the remainder is, there's an understanding, a direction that at least 50% of the auctioned allowances should be reinvested in climate-related purposes. In looking at this, we found a much greater share is happening than that. So over a third of the total asset value in the EU is being reinvested in these programs. On top of that, we have all sorts of subnational stuff going on in the EU. This picture does not yet include Sweden because it's not updated. This is showing commitments at the member state level. Rather than just operating underneath the emissions cap only, they're doing additional measures, just as the states inside RGGI or Quebec is doing something additional and California is doing something additional. And this is showing the coal phase-out plans in the EU with the Germany showing in hashtag because it's still very much in debate. So I hope I've convinced you that there's all sorts of program-related investments and all sorts of additional jurisdictional activities being undertaken that are pushing down allowance prices, and we're stuck with what I call the waterbed effect, which we haven't solved yet, what we're going to do about this. The EU has looked at this problem of declining prices and the concern that it's a real threat to the survival of the program, and examined a number of potential reforms. Their concern is that that the low prices are not sufficient to incent innovation, as was mentioned earlier, that low prices are maybe a block to actual mitigation efforts that are pursued by the NGOs and the activities and other activists, and the regulatory risk that if the price is so low, maybe this program isn't even going to be here tomorrow. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And the EU conducted repeated administrative reviews and did some somewhat meaningful things to address this program over time by modestly strengthening the cap, doing this backloading of allowances, which for my money didn't really add up to much. It just was the delay of allowances that were otherwise going to enter the program, and then introduced the Market Stability Reserve, which is an idea, it's sort of a quantity, it's a control in the program that's triggered by the quantity of allowances that are being held and not yet used for compliance. And so it's this bank, as the bank gets bigger, they're saying, oh, if the bank gets really big, that's going to be a signal that we have low prices or associated with low prices, and so they put controls that are triggered by the size of the bank. Because I had planned for 20 minutes and not 15, I'm going to jump over some slides here and just get to the bottom. This week, actually, I'm surprised that Miranda or someone else didn't bring this up earlier, but this week the European Parliament approved a more substantial effort, and now it goes back to the member states for final approval, a strengthening of the cap, the goals for the next decade, and then a declaration that 57% of the allowances should be auctioned in the next decade, doubling of the withdrawal rate in this Market Stability Reserve. But the most important thing is that these allowances that get held out of the market and held till later, that some of them would actually get canceled. And so into an economic way of thinking, well, if you actually constrict supply, you might finally start to have some effect on price, rather than just say, oh, well, we'll sell them next year and we'll sell them the year after that. Then any long-term planning would say, well, those allowances are ultimately going to be available anyway. But now the new decision allows member states to potentially cancel allowances, and there's an automatic rule that if essentially the size of banks get to be greater than 1 year's auctioned supply, they're automatically canceled, starting in the next decade. If I'm being a little fast and loose on some of the details, if it matters, you guys can correct me. So the North American programs instead have price controls, direct controls on prices. There's a widespread use of auctions, including consignment auctions. So when allowances are given away for free in California, for example, they have to be turned around and auctioned, and the revenue goes back to those entities. And there's reserve prices in those auctions that directly provide a price floor. And then I want to just close by talking about RGGI's new design that introduces something that I think is a real path-breaking improvement going forward that both the Western Climate Initiative and the EU can learn from. So various ones of us have said minimum prices or auction reserve prices so far, so I want to make sure you understand what they are. It's just saying that there's a price below which allowances won't sell. And if you go on eBay, you're going to see this. The first time it was ever, my son pointed out to me, Dad, that's just like when you sold your camera on eBay. When you sell something, there's a starting bid that you're willing to accept. So it's basically saying that to government policymakers, they're not going to sell an allowance for any price below some level. Is a minimum price viable in the EU? Well, opponents of a minimum price had argued that it would interfere with the efficient operations of the market. There'd be administratively set, it might be too high, and in case of a breakthrough technology, then we set the price at the wrong level, or it would be tantamount to a tax. We turn the program into a tax, which would trigger the unanimity rule. I guess I'm going to I have a bunch of slides that answer this, but I think in the interest of time, I'm going to just say that, I'll just do these very quickly. The idea that the efficient market would equalize marginal abatement costs, but that's not happening now because we've heard so much about overlapping policies, that different policies are already in place that are achieving very different costs per ton of emission reduction. So you can't really say that the EU ETS is exactly efficient as a continent-wide carbon policy. Price regulation in markets might get messed up by having a minimum price, but the overlapping policies raise abasement costs while driving down allowance prices, right? Like if you have like in Quebec and Ontario and California, the Western Climate Initiative regulates transportation, but you have a low carbon fuel standard pushing pressure to achieve emission reductions out of transportation, that's going to drive down the allowance price in the cap and trade program. So this is replete in the EU as well. The market should send a consistent price signal, it's argued. Well, prices are well below the notions of the social cost of carbon that were anticipated, we saw this slide earlier, anticipated to be necessary to really drive decarbonization in the EU. So, and finally, that requires the cap to be set efficiently in the first place, which arguably it has not been so far. So, and we did legal analysis. I'm not going to linger on this to convince ourselves and hopefully others that it does not trigger the unanimity rule to introduce a minimum price, because the minimum price in a trading program does not set the price and it is not a tax. And now I'm going to show you why, and then I'll be done with 2 more slides, I think. So this is back to RGGI. I mentioned that in 2017 they did an innovative, I think, breakthrough in program design that is just the tip of, or just the opening of the door, a crack in the door of where I think these trading programs should move going forward, and I hope there's lessons for Canada and the EU in this. This is the picture I showed you before, and this is the expected demand, and this is what happens when demand falls, as it always does. There's no change in emissions. It's just the Waterbed effect. So the EU introduced a price step. In addition to its price floor, they introduced a price step above that. And this price step said, well, for certain quantity of allowances, we're going to put a reserve price on those. And I'm going to I've got 100 cameras to sell. Well, for 10 of them, I'm going to put a price. I'm not going to sell them below $6, and the rest of them I'll sell for anything above $2. That's essentially what they're doing here. And so, in this design, then, if the demand falls, as it always does, then there's going to be a sharing of the benefits of the innovation or whatever else is driving this market dynamic between the environment and between economic interests. So there's going to be some quantity of allowances that don't sell, and there's going to be fewer emissions as a consequence, but there also will be a lower price. This obviously introduces a new policy negotiation over how that sharing is achieved, but in general, when you're trying to reach agreements in the public process, sharing is a good word. So RGGI's new design is a big deal. I just want to say, in our modeling that we did to try to help support this thinking, you can use your imagination to imagine, well, why not have 2 steps? Why not have 4 steps? Why not maybe just have a consistent ramp? And so that's why we refer to this as quantities with prices, that you can imagine different tranches of, because if you sent your child to the grocery store to buy a couple oranges, and they got there and they found out that the oranges were half price, you might be glad that they bought a couple extra oranges and brought them home. It was a deal. So regulators are sending instructions to the market ahead of time about what's the politically acceptable emission reduction target for the time being, and if it turns out to be cheaper than we thought it was going to be, which it always does, then we'd like to harvest additional emission reductions in order to drive this dynamic process of further innovation and further emission reductions. So I think it's a big deal what Reggie's doing. And relevance to the discussion of price supports in the EU setting is that with that price step, you can see that that step or any individual step cannot possibly be described as setting the price because there's multiple price steps. So which price step is the one that's supposedly turning the program into a tax? And as the other thing that's really of interest and I think relevant to the EU and perhaps to Canada as well is that Reggie, at the time this was decided, was a coalition of a program involving 9 states, but only 7 states actually adopted that design and put that reserve price in. 2 states did not. So if the price falls down to that level, there's going to be an implicit transfer to those 2 states from the other 7 states because they'll sell all their allowances at a price that's higher than it otherwise would be. But the 7 states that are part of this coalition, this leading coalition, will sell fewer allowances. Imagine we rename the variables in that description and that the leadership states are France, the UK, and Germany, and the states that are not able politically to join that coalition are Poland or other Eastern European countries. Then this manifests an implicit transfer from one part of Europe to another that might help enable greater ambition overall in the EU. So in conclusion, I want to just leave you with these points. I'm sorry I've been such a whirlwind here, but there's always downward pressure on prices in these trading programs. If you don't think about it ahead of time in the program design, the emissions cap is an emissions floor, unleashing the waterbed effect and eroding all of our additional actions, which is exactly the opposite of what we want to try to incent. We want to change social norms. We want to get people to innovate at the individual and local level. The EU approach has differed from the North American approach and seems less effective so far, but nonetheless, I give them credit for not giving up on the patient. And both approaches, both in Europe and in North America, have continued to adapt and improve over time. And I think the new Reggie innovation may be an enduring model that we can learn from. So, thank you.